Yes, so good day. I am Axel Fitzgerald Bulawan from the University of the Philippines, Tacloban. I thank the Asian Center for allowing me to present virtually, given my distance to Metro Manila. I am happy to present my paper, The Effects of Japan's Doubling of Defense Spending on Economic Output. So Liang and Tan categorized Japanese military history into four phases. After World War II, Japan implemented a defense policy that limited military spending on defensive capabilities to avoid being viewed as being escalatory and to focus on rebuilding their economy. Since then, Japan has limited their military spending to 1% of GDP. This is the first phase. The second phase, from 1962 to 2001, saw the fourfold increase of defense expenditure while maintaining the 1% cap as a result of fast economic growth. The third phase, from 2002 to 2017, military spending stagnated as Japan's economic growth slowed. In response to increased Chinese aggression, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe declared that it wouldn't be implementing the 1% cap anymore. In 2022, Prime Minister Fumio Kishida revealed that the country would be doubling its defense spending by 2027, from 1% of GDP to 2%. This is the fourth and current phase. So in economics, we know that military spending is a component of government expenditure, which itself is a component of economic output as represented by the gross domestic product or GDP. The question now, especially given that Japan foresees a doubling of defense spending the next 5 years, is what is its possible effects on economic output? How have this relationship between defense spending and GDP look like in Japan's history? Would it increase or decrease the country's GDP? So the relationship between military expenditure and economic output has been extensively studied in economics. This all started with Benoit's seminal paper in 1973, which found that higher spending has a positive effect on economic growth. Several studies in the literature after Benoit aim to replicate and test this relationship, which now is dubbed as the Benoit hypothesis. However, research on this relationship has been inconclusive. Some posit that there is a positive relationship between the two variables, while some have observed the reverse, that military spending instead causes a decline in economic growth, while some studies also found an insignificant relationship between defense spending and economic growth. What then explains the difference in results in the Benoit hypothesis? The literature points to two things. First, the difference may be a result of peculiar differences in each country. So, for instance, where a country sources its defense capabilities may affect whether or not it positively affects their GDP. Second, according to RAM, it might be because of the differences in methodology. Some use various methodologies which arrive at different results. In the literature, however, I found that the most common method employed is simple regression analysis. Basically, this study followed the standard GDP model shown in equation 1, which sees GDP as a function of consumption, investment, government spending, which defense spending is a part of, exports and imports. Using that economic model, we arrive at the estimation model in equation 2. The difference here is that we take out military spending from total government spending, so it's non-military government expenditure. So finally, we also wanted to find out the mechanisms through which military spending affected Japanese economic output at different points in time. So this study conducted OLS estimation using equation 3 for each of the four periods explained earlier. Here we substitute certain variables to relate to military spending. So for instance, instead of plainly exports, we use arms exports and etc. Results and discussion. Here we have the summary statistics of the different time series. We see that certain variables, for certain variables, there is less data, like in health expenditure, which affects the number of observations in the regression results. Here we have the results of the correlation analysis. We observe here that consumption, investment, military expenditure, non-military government spending, exports, imports, government investment, education, and health expenditures are all positively correlated to GDP with at least a significance level of 99%. On the other hand, we see that both arms exports and arms imports have a negative correlation to GDP with a significance level of 99.9%. This table shows the OLS estimation using the standard GDP model. The coefficients show that consumption, investment, non-government spending, and exports have a positive effect on GDP. On the other hand, military expenditure and imports have a negative impact on economic output. Specifically, the coefficient for military spending is negative 0.6891, signifying that a $1 increase in military spending results in a 0.6891 decrease in GDP. Notably, this shows that military spending has a significant negative impact on economic output, rejecting the Benoit hypothesis in the case of Japan. Here we have the results of the OLS estimation using the adapted GDP model in an attempt to explain why military spending has a detrimental effect on Japanese economic output. 3 regression runs were conducted, one for each of the 4 phases of military spending in Japan, to explain how domestic output of Japan has been influenced by the independent variables over several specific economic periods in the history of Japan. The study was not able to conduct OLS estimation on the first phase because of the insufficient data for that period. So as observed, several variables were dropped in the regression analysis for 2 reasons. First, independent variables were dropped when they caused multicollinearity in the model. For instance, health expenditure data were excluded in the OLS estimation for all 3 phases because they had a large variance inflation factor, or the VIF, while government investment was cut from the analysis because they inflated the mean VIF. Second, the lack of government investment data from 1960 to 1993, which encompasses the whole of Phase 1 and some part of Phase 2, made it unable to produce regression results for that specific phase. As such, it was dropped in the Phase 2 OLS estimation. The OLS estimation results reveal 3 key findings. So first, military expenditure had a positive effect on GDP during phases 2 and 3 from 1962 to 2017, and only had a negative effect starting phase 1 beginning 2018. This coincides with Japan's proclamation diverging from the 1% defense spending rule. Second, arms imports have a large negative impact on economic output in the first and second phases. In phase 3, it has a positive coefficient, although it is not statistically significant. This could be attributed to the small sample size of phase 3, only covering 5 observations given that the phase had recently started in 2018. The coefficients show that a $1 increase in arms imports results in a 1,000 times decrease in Japanese GDP. And third, military expenditure has a larger effect on economic output relative to other variables. Specifically, in phase 2, military expenditure has a larger positive coefficient than both consumption and education expenditure. The results of this study show that military expenditure in Japan has a negative effect on GDP, with every $1 spent on military capabilities decreasing economic output by $0.6891. So put differently, every unit of defense spending in Japan results in more than half a decrease in GDP. This contradicts previous results of other studies, like in Ward et al. In 1995, which show that an increased defense burden does not affect the country's economic performance. This study essentially does not find evidence for the Benoit hypothesis, which posits that military spending and economic growth are positively related in the case of Japan. How does military cause a negative impact on economic output? This paper revealed that Japan mainly had substantial arms imports relative to the amount of arms it exports. Further, this paper shows that the arms importation hurts GDP, with every increase in arms imports resulting in a thousand-fold decrease in economic output. Arms imports are essentially importation, like any other types of importation, which represents a flight of economic output as the country is purchased from another country. As such, it is not part of domestic output. Thus, Japanese military spending has a negative impact on GDP as it sources its main military capabilities from abroad. So, as for the recommendations for further study, future researchers could employ other methods such as ARDL, VAR, and Granger causation in the case of Japanese military spending. Further, it might be worthwhile to study the impact of Japanese military spending in 2028 when the country expects to have completely doubled its defense spending from 1% of GDP to 2%. So this paper illustrates the choices society has to make in allocating resources between guns or butter, a trade-off between spending money towards military capabilities or other programs such as education, health, and welfare. The positive or negative effect of military spending on GDP poses a fundamental economic question for Japan's policymakers. How best to allocate its scarce resources? How do you find the optimal level of military spending such that it does not have a detrimental effect on economic growth, or at the very least, minimize its effects? Future researchers must study this more closely. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.